The detention of a vessel flying the Russian flag in the North Atlantic underscores the decisive leadership of the United States and President Trump. This was emphasized by Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha. On social media, he wrote that Ukraine welcomes this approach to relations with Russia, to act, not to be afraid. Sybiha noted that such a bold approach is also relevant for the peace process and for bringing lasting peace closer. Let us recall that the day before, the U.S. seized 2 tankers linked to Venezuela. One of them was sailing under the flag of the Russian Federation and was accompanied by a Russian ship and the submarine tanker Bella. Another, also known as Marinera, was intercepted with the help of the British, in particular using Air Force aircraft. American officials claim that this very tanker is part of the so-called shadow fleet that transported oil for Venezuela, Russia, and Iran. And also, despite the seizure of Russian tankers, good relations between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin will remain. Well, at least that's the opinion expressed by White House spokesperson Caroline Leavitt. However, according to her, the U.S. president is not afraid to continue seizing sanctioned oil tankers. Even though this could increase tensions in relations with Russia and China. We'll be talking about all this and more next, especially since we have a guest in the studio. Stanislav Zhelikhovsky, PhD in political science, corresponding member of the Ukrainian Academy of Geopolitics and Geostrategy. Mr. Stanislav, welcome.
Good afternoon.
You know, I'd actually like to start with something personal, or rather from a personal perspective. What does this statement from the White House spokesperson mean, saying supposedly that good relations will be maintained? Especially considering that the Kremlin and, well, usually Medvedev is quick to post something, but this time they're silent.
In my opinion, this means that the U.S. does not expect Russia to react negatively in any way. We saw this in the situation related to the U.S. special operation in Venezuela. Yes, there were critical statements from Moscow, but they gradually became softer. And we can see that now the Russian Federation is not reacting very strongly to what is happening around Venezuela, around its former dictator Nicolas Maduro, his wife, and so on. So in fact, we see that Russia, which is now they are in a very difficult situation, primarily economically, but they also remain in isolation. This is understandable because this country continues to carry out a full-scale aggression against Ukraine. And likewise, it sets itself against the entire civilized world. And considering its current difficult, even one could say truly pitiful state, I think that's precisely why Putin doesn't want to quarrel with anyone at this particular moment. The head of the American state, Donald Trump. And overall, this is understandable with America because he still sees, to some extent, a window of opportunity for Russia precisely during the Trump administration. That's why he doesn't take any drastic steps to worsen relations, since he understands that the consequences could be even more catastrophic for Russia. And that's why I assume that similar raids, similar operations by the U.S. armed forces, their various Marine Corps and so on may continue in the future, especially since they are not violating anything if we're talking about the Americans. Indeed, these are vessels of the Shadow Fleet, of a sanction-evading nature, which violate what has been imposed against this sector, the illegal oil sector, and so on. So in fact, I think that Trump may continue to act in this way. Yes, it is absolutely crucial to understand that Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, will still not take any aggressive or undermining actions aimed at jeopardizing the significant and positive progress that has been carefully made over the past year. And I think this particular situation can also be clearly seen as an important element of diplomatic pressure coming from Washington, the capital of the United States, directly on the Russian Federation. We have to understand that, after all, Donald Trump would like to achieve a peaceful settlement, and at the same time, he would also like, let's say, to show that he is capable of taking action, decisive steps against certain countries. Therefore, I think that he does not perceive Russia as an equal country, equal to itself, equal to America. That's what is meant. And I think that America will continue to act in this direction. And now we must understand that there is an even bigger geopolitical game being played by Trump. Here he is also targeting others. Countries like China and India, which buy Russian energy resources at discounted prices, and which, let's say, then let's put it this way, strengthen their capabilities, and this is also unacceptable for America, especially when we talk about the People's Republic of China. And we must understand that right now, indeed, the stakes are rising. And even though it seemed that Trump supposedly wants to focus America's foreign policy mainly on the Western Hemisphere, he is still closely monitoring the situation in the world. Similarly, if we talk, for example, about China and its junior partner, the Russian Federation, he, let's say, has not taken the issue of countering these competitors off the agenda, although in reality he sees the greatest competition coming specifically from China, not from Russia. But Russia, let's put it this way, is a significant country that consistently helps China, in particular with its abundant natural resources and other valuable capabilities, providing substantial support. And also, by the way, I want to strongly emphasize that Washington clearly and fully understands that Russia could potentially help China in the event of a military intervention in Taiwan, which is absolutely unacceptable for America. And even in this updated US national security strategy, there is also an emphasis on supporting Taiwan and in general on America's presence in the Indo-Pacific region. So here we can view all of this in the context of Trump's grand political game. It is quite specific, indeed it is often unpredictable, but we clearly see that former President Trump is still very much capable of making significant decisions that are quite clearly understood in major capitals like Moscow or Beijing, for example.
A quick clarification, Mr. Stanislav, before we move on to a more openly sanctions-related topic. Just to clarify, please, you mentioned the unpredictability of Donald Trump's policies. Returning to this story, it was loud and undoubtedly yesterday all the news was about these tankers. On the one hand, we have the fact that the Russian vessel was being tracked for 2 weeks. Another point, if I'm not mistaken, the Danes had already tried to board a Russian tanker before this, and successfully so. Thank you. Another point, a third point. The tanker was accompanied by a warship and a submarine. That too, well, seems hardly a coincidence. Russian ones. Russian, of course. I wanted to clarify with you very briefly about, the impulsiveness, the element of surprise, and the calculated nature of the actions of both sides in this situation.
Well, yes, indeed, we can talk about various possible combinations here. But by the way, if we're talking about the Russian factor, well, as far as I know, there was no resistance at all.
There wasn't.
So in reality, observation is clear, but actually, I don't rule out that perhaps Putin, again, this is just an assumption, maybe he was hoping that America wouldn't intervene to seize this vessel. First of all...
And just blink, right?
Something like that. And then Putin would have shown, look, we are still a strong Russia. People fear us and so on, but we see that this didn't work. So this once again shows just how vulnerable the Russian Federation is. Therefore, I think such an incident could encourage even more the American administration to make new decisive decisions regarding certain vessels. I do not rule out that this could later be accompanied by the introduction of new sanctions against certain units of the Shadow Fleet, both by the Americans and the Europeans. It will happen a bit later, but nonetheless we need to understand, by the way, in principle, the 20th package of European Union sanctions is currently being finalized, and I think the Shadow Fleet will definitely be included there, which will fall under the restrictions. In any case, this will give the green light to the same Donald Trump administration, meaning that certain vessels, especially those connected to Venezuela, can indeed be targeted. Here, as they say, there is complete freedom to maneuver. Complete freedom of action for the Donald Trump administration.